Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. Really thrilled that Fred Fuchs is with us. As you know, Fred is going to be a mentor at our October retreat, and we couldn't be more pleased to have him here. Just a quick note, he needs to leave at 10:45, so we'll give a little warning before, but John and I are going to stay in case there are any lingering questions or any information you'd like. So that with that said, John, do you want to?
Yeah, welcome everybody. Robin and I are the hosts and the owners of Ignite the Spark Retreat. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of this event. But one of our very awesome mentors is here with us today, Mr. Fred Fuchs. I just want to give you a quick heads up. We're recording this, and so if you can make sure that you are muted, because that can disrupt the recording. Also, we are going to have a time where you can ask some questions of Fred. That will be probably the last 10 to 15 minutes, but you can put those questions in the chat box, and Robin and I will read them later. And then, Robin, anything else you want to say about Fred?
No, I just want everybody to get the benefit of Fred's wisdom, so I won't talk.
Okay, well, Fred, I've got a question for you, and this is something that I actually received when I worked at a literary agency years ago in Hollywood. All the time, I would answer the phone, and somebody from somewhere in the middle of the country would be calling up saying, "Hey, do you accept scripts?" And I'd have to say, "Sorry, we don't. Only on a referral basis." And that obviously was very frustrating to many people. And they often ask, well, how do I get my script seen if I'm not in Hollywood, if I don't know anybody in Hollywood? And there's been several years since I worked in that agency, and things have changed even more so. But if someone were to stop you on the street and just ask you, "Fred, I've got this script that I really think is great, but nobody's will take a look at it," what would you tell them? How can they get past these so-called gatekeepers?
Well, that's a great question. And it's an ongoing problem and issue. But you know, what can I say? If you've written the script and it's done and it's finished, you just have to put it out there in any possible way you can. And you just never know, because it may just land on somebody's desk somewhere. Now, obviously, the talent agencies in Hollywood are very specific rules about that, because they're all worried about lawsuits and, people stealing the material or people accusing you of stealing their material. But independent producers are not going to be that worried. And personally, I think, as a writer, sure, you can be worried that someone's going to steal your idea, but what can you do? I really believe you put it out to the universe, and if it's going to find someone, it will. And I can tell you that when I was president of American Zoetrope, Francis Coppola's company, we would get unsolicited scripts, and I would look at them. And in fact, I can remember one because it actually got made into a Hollywood movie for a $40 million budget, because coincidentally, if you believe in coincidences, it was exactly what I was looking for, because we had just finished a film, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it was very successful. And next thing, about 3 months after it came out, a script arrives. It was written by a truck driver in Sacramento who had never, sold a script in his life, and it was a script based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Oh, cool.
Never had occurred to us that we should do that, but suddenly there's a script, and I read the script, and it was pretty good. And then, of course, from the studio's point of view, oh, well, you made all this money on Bram Stoker's Dracula, why not do Mary Shelley's Frank? And the script got made, and as a Hollywood movie. I mean, obviously it got rewritten and changed over the time, but the original writer got a credit, he got paid. So it happens, it does happen. And that's just, that's the incredible thing about the film and television industry in Hollywood, is that there's no standard path. There's no right way to do things. Everything happens with, I meet someone playing basketball, pick up basketball on the beach in Venice, and oh, I have a script, and I've learned you never know where a great idea is going to come from. So you pay attention. I mean, at least I think the intelligent producers do, and you call it a miracle, but things happen. So it can be very discouraging, but don't give up. If you give up, then it definitely won't happen. But if you keep putting it out there, and you just don't know. So I don't know if that's a good answer, John, but so you're right. The gatekeepers are challenging, and it's worse than ever. And certainly the idea of development is very different. It's very hard to just pitch an idea and get funding to write the script unless you have a track record and everything else. Even established writers now have to really develop a first draft themselves. They don't, and go out with a spec script, but it still happens all the time, that scripts by unknown writers get made. So
that's great. That's really great, because there are so many rules and regulations, and don't do this and don't do that. And pretty much everybody you talk to has a different slant on how to do it and what the right approach is. So I really like that.
Well, especially now, because Hollywood is no longer the center of the film industry, and movies are being made everywhere, all over the world. The cost of production is so much less than it used to be. And you just never know when your idea and your vision is going to align with some producer, some investor, some actor, some director. But they'll never know unless you put it out there. So I don't know what else to say. I'm sure there are different sites that you can do this at, but again, there are so many non-traditional ways that a lot of the rules that always existed have really don't matter that much anymore. It's just changed a lot. It's become much more democratized than it's ever been.
That's great.
Fred, what you just said reminds me of what one of the most valuable pieces of advice I got in film school. And my professor said, tenacity is the most important aspect, because there's a lot of talented writers out there that will never see their work because, like you said, they gave up. So you just never know. So basically, and there's some people that aren't the best writers whose work we have seen maybe, or we will see, because they never gave up. So I love.
Oh, it's absolutely true. There's a lot of talented people out there. There's no question about it. But it does take perseverance. It does take, tenacity, and you really have to believe, because I don't know, I don't want to get too woo, but it's very energetic, I think, the way things actually work. And when you put something out there with a very positive and meaningful and passionate, force behind it, crazy things happen, and so many. And I had scripts that it would take 8 years before they ever got made, So when I said no, then it stopped. And as long as I kept trying, then it was never dead, So, you're the one who really ultimately decides the fate of your project.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite project?
Do I have a favorite project?
Yeah.
That's like asking me if I have a favorite child. Yeah, they're all, I love them all,
They're all your babies. Yeah.
Some worked out better than others. Some, were more successful than others. But, I love them all, or I wouldn't have probably done them. I was very lucky. I wasn't just doing it for a job. This was my passion. It was my, my life, So that's a really tough question to answer, Robin.
Yeah. Okay.
I loved it for different reasons.
Yeah.
What if we got more specific, like a project you did for Coppola?
Well, one of the first films I did for him was The Godfather Part 3. And I was young. I was like 34 or something. And I'd produced 1 or 2 movies. And that was a very complicated film because the expectations were so high, right? And the idea of getting the same cast together, 20 years later, the same actors playing the same characters 20 years later, that's a very ambitious concept. And it was a lot of work and really challenging, difficult project. And ultimately, you know, it had mixed reviews. I mean, we got 7 Academy Award nominations, so I wouldn't say it wasn't unrecognized, but
Right.
yeah, so that certainly was a film that I learned a tremendous amount on, and watched, and you know, watching Coppola, of course, you know, was like going to the best film school in the world, you know, because you learned everything just watching him, you know, and seeing how he did things.
Right. Gosh, that's amazing. What an
I was
immersion.
very lucky, very, very.
Well, I mean, speaking of Coppola, what would you say was one of the most valuable lessons you learned from him?
Well, what the most valuable lesson is that, you know, and I think it's true with all storytelling. I don't care if it's a film, a TV show, a play, or, but it really is about having, you know, having passion, having a real purpose, and to know why you are doing something. And what I find the most difficult thing is when people just want to, you know, do this to make money, you know, and they're trying to design a project because, oh, I think this will be commercial, and oh, you know, that movie made a lot of money, so I'll do a copy of that movie. And it really has nothing to do with them as a human
Yeah.
being, what their story is, what their passion is, and it's just some kind of, you know, concoction they're trying to analytically or intellectually come up with. And working with Coppola, and we produced other movies, not just his movies. Every time it worked, it was because somewhere behind, and usually it was the writer, but sometimes it was the director. There was just this passion and vision to tell a story that actually meant something to them. And when
Mhm.
something to them, the audience kind of feels that. And
Right.
you can all tell, right, guys, as viewers, when something has just been concocted for financial gain versus there's a story that has, you know, some real meaning, or I use the word take home value. You know, you're not just eating another McDonald's hamburger. This
Right.
is me talking, right? A lot of people like McDonald's hamburgers. I don't like McDonald's hamburgers. I'd rather have something a little different, a little more unusual. And I
Yeah.
think that's often, especially for a young emerging writer, to really find a story that is meaningful to you, that it's your story that you have to tell. I worked at a television network for many years, and at the CBC in Canada, and I was, you know, at that point, you know, a buyer. So people would come in and pitch me, and they would always ask me, "What are you looking for? Do you want another television? You know, do you need another medical show? Do you need a cop show? What are you looking for?" And I said, "I have no idea what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is the story you have to tell. That's your passionate personal story. That's what's going to work. That's what people are going to get excited about, not
Yeah.
some concoction that you think might or might not be commercial." And I certainly don't know. And I'm the executive who's in charge of deciding what TV shows get made. So,
Right. Right. And also, I think like it seems that every time there's a hit, like say Honora this last year, when you talk to executives, it's I want another Honora, exactly like that, but a little different. And then by the time that script is written or it gets picked up, Honora is so far in the rearview mirror. You know, it's that chasing.
yeah,
Story.
again, it really depends. I mean, look, Mission Impossible 8 just came out, you know,
Uh-huh.
and it's great. And, you know, I think it's fantastic that Tom Cruise has this passion for those movies and figured out a formula that works great. But that's not usually where the opportunity lies for emerging writers. Yeah.
Right. We do have a question here. Somebody's asking, what do you think about proof of concept shorts?
Oh,
And
I think shorts are fantastic. I,
uh-huh.
you know, so many short films get made into movies, right? And student films, you know, get made into movies. Yeah, I think it's great if you, beyond just having a screenplay, shoot a 10-minute short. Could be a couple of scenes. It could be, I don't know what it is, but
Yeah.
it's a great idea if you can do that. because again, it just sort of brings the words alive, instead of just words on a page. And I think as a writer, it'll also be extremely helpful for you to hear the words spoken. And, often we would, take scripts and we would have, just local actors come in and read the script around the table, and you have a much better feeling for what the script is, and how it might work. And so, yes, I'm a big fan of that idea.
That's great. And this person has gone the extra mile with attaching a Broadway director, and he's gotten a budget put together and an actor who's been in a nominated film and blah, blah. So he's doing his homework.
That's fantastic. Obviously, what you don't want to do is do a short with, not untalented people, because then you may be doing your script a disservice if it's just bad because of the lack of talent in the little film.
Yeah.
If you could find, pretty good people to work with, then I think it's a good idea.
That's great.
Well, speaking of process, I'm kind of curious what you think and what you would say to this, because you also have worked very much so in TV, starting with Coppola, because you've mentioned you had started a TV division, but then you became the executive director at the CBC, and you were over some pretty amazing TV shows. So, as from the writer standpoint, what does a TV writer need to know or do differently than just writing, say, a feature spec? Like, what do they need to be?
Another great question. So here's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but this, to me, is sort of proven true. When you think about a film, you have basically 2 hours, 90 minutes to 2 hours. And what's really important in a film becomes the narrative, right? Because you have to have a story and tell it all in 90 minutes, right? So you have to have the story, the narrative, in my mind, is sort of the most important thing. And then you have characters who sort of, unfold the narrative. You follow the narrative through the characters. TV is exactly the opposite. TV is all about character, because you're going to be watching this character for 6 hours, 2 hours, whatever, 4 seasons, right? Mm-hmm. So the most important thing I look for as an executive is, are there really interesting characters and an interesting, dynamics between the characters and everything else? Because they're going to be lots of narratives, right? You're going to, every episode is going to be a different narrative, right? So it's really so it's characters, and then you develop narratives to inform who these characters are. So the audience gets to learn who the characters are. And as you can see with film, you don't have time to work that way. It really has to be more narrative driven. So there's sort of one example of just a way to think about approaching any story. And is this really a film? Could it be a TV series? What would it be like if it was one or the other? And which is it better suited for in your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that, you often hear about having a show Bible alongside your pilot? How important was that to you? Was there any other supplemental things besides the pilot?
Yeah, well, again, yes, because in television, film, it's sort of easy. It's a script, and it may get better, it may get rewritten, but you can sort of see the whole thing. In television, a pilot script does not tell you the whole thing. It just tells you the first story. So certainly having additional information, very important to sort of have character summaries so people can see what's going to happen to the character throughout the show, having potential episodic storylines or some sense of the arc of the series. Yes, so I think for television, it is important to have more than just a pilot script. You really need to have, I don't use the word Bible because that's sort of a very old-fashioned specific time, but yes, you need some kind of other document that has characters presented and potential other episodic ideas presented. Very.
And now back from New York, where his musical was performed this last week, is our friend George, who's asking how to connect with an actor or director that you think would be great for the project.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you that agents are usually a waste of time because agents are like heat-seeking missiles. All they're interested in is transactions and how quickly can they get a transaction done.
Yeah.
More likely, the person to try to find is that actor or director's manager, because the managers really are working with the talent for the long haul. They're not just worrying about what their next role is or their next job is. And good managers and good management company have people who read scripts and who are review material because they are looking for projects for their director and for their writers. Obviously, actors and directors have their own production companies, and if there's someone who you really think specifically is good for you, you could try the production company directly. But managers are sort of the secret weapon these days that really are much more important than agents are anymore,
Yeah.
in terms of getting material to talent.
Joan Lane, one of our other mentors, tells the story of after seeing The King's Speech as a stage play, which she shepherded and developed into the great movie that it is, she found out where Geoffrey Rush lived in Australia. She lives in
That's right.
London.
Track them down, yeah.
And she got a friend of hers who lives in Australia to physically deliver slip it into his mailbox or under his gate or something.
Robin, there are a million different ways.
There's a million stories. Yeah.
But and again, if you have an existing IP, it could be a play, it could be, there's a novel or there's a short story or a short film. It is always helpful to have something that exists. In fact, often what we would do, and when someone had a great idea, we would say, don't write a script, write a short story. We would much rather develop it as a short story with you. And once there's a great short story, then we will write the screenplay. And in fact, we started a short story magazine in New York City called Zoetrope All Stories. And that's how we developed a bunch of projects. Sometimes I met someone who had a script and it was very complicated, or maybe it was like a fantasy or something. I said, you know what? Let's go make a graphic novel. So we create the graphic novel first. And then once we had a graphic novel, then we would go pitch the script for the project because people could sort of understand it and recognize that there was something, that was pre-existed or was meaningful or had worked in the past. So there are lots of little tricks like that instead of, I have to write a screenplay. My analogy is writing a screenplay is kind of like doing blueprints of a house, right? It's very craft, very specific structurally and everything else. And that's hard to do blueprints when you haven't designed the house yet. Right? So
you don't know where it's going to be. Is it on a hillside?
Before you try, making the blueprints or the screenplay.
Yeah. All the changes in the industry. What advice, and you've covered some of it really nicely already, but what advice would you consider to be old advice? For example, it was a great
one of the things I think a lot about these days, how much the process of production has been democratized, right? You can shoot on video, you can shoot with your iPhone, you can edit on your computer. The costs of production have dropped so significantly that actually it's possible to get films made. You can make I'm involved with films now that are $300,000 or $100,000. And you can make a decent looking movie for $300,000 these days. Marketing's a whole nother issue, but at least you can get things made. But the challenge is you have to write something that can be produced for that amount of money. So I just finished a film in Greece with the son of one of my friends who's a producer there. So we sat down, and he was a commercial producer, a director, and he wanted to do his first feature. I said, great, let's do a film that all take place in one location in one night and has 7 characters, and we could do it for $300,000. So sometimes you have to think about, that. And if you're going to write some giant historical drama, with giant action scenes and things like that, that's going to be harder to get someone to buy and harder to get it made. So sometimes really you can, especially now, you can think about your script or your story and what is it that you want to do. Just think about what is it going to take to actually make this. And sometimes the simpler, the easier will be. Sometimes, some wealthy person may just want to, finance it themselves, or, who knows? But you leave so many more options when it's possible to make your story for, a reasonable price.
Nice.
Great.
Fred, going back to your CBC days, I'm curious how that transition was for you, going from, working for American Zoetrope to being the executive director at the CBC. How did it change your responsibility?
It was incredibly different because all my life I was selling. When you're a producer, you're selling, and looking for financing. And as a network executive, I was a buyer. So that's a completely different world. Then as a buyer, you have a different obligation because you have a specific audience. It's not like a movie where, who knows who's going to come. But, with the CBC, and that's like the BBC, right? It's the public broadcasting. Again, we knew who our audience was. We knew our demographics. We knew our numbers. We knew our time slots. So you really are, very much more aware of looking for projects that you think, ultimately still have to be original stories and things that people want to do, but that somehow speak to your audience. And then, of course, we had other complication because our role was to help and, to reinforce Canadian identity. So we had to find projects that really spoke to the populace of Canada and the values and traditions of what we believe Canada represents. So I'll give you an example. One day, a woman comes into my office and she had done a short film in Saskatchewan, at university. And she was a Muslim woman. And she wrote this and did this little short film about what it was like for her growing up Muslim in Saskatchewan, which is like Midwest, right? And it was very funny. And at the heart, you really understood that basically her life was like anybody's life. Her family's not that different than anybody's family. And so we wound up doing a half-hour sitcom called Little Mosque on the Prairie. And it was very successful and funny. Never could have made this in the US back then. This was probably 2006, I want to say. And but it was a perfect example of someone who just had their story they wanted to tell, but it actually aligned, coincidentally or not, with something that as a buyer we were looking for, which was something new. So that's how strange it is. That's how weird stuff happens.
Yeah, that's great. Making a market, where you may not know if one exists, but of course, in the case of CBC, you knew your market really well. But yeah, sometimes things come out of left field. You can't imagine where somebody got the idea or how it ever made it to the screen, but you're so right, it happens frequently. That's great. We have another question. Any special ways to get an animated project in front of the right people?
Well, that's interesting because animation has totally been transformed. It's a completely different industry because of AI, right? So there's so much that can be done so much less expensively now than ever before. Do a big animated feature, or CGI, it was $100 million, minimum, right? For a big movie like that. Those costs are dropping so rapidly now. And obviously there's different technology for animation. And I did a stop motion animation project, and we were able to do it incredibly inexpensively because suddenly we didn't have to shoot on film anymore. We could shoot with video. And so
what was the name of that project, Fred?
It's called What It's Like Being Alone. And the way what happened is I met a young kid out of film school, and he had written a little book, like a little Edward Gorey children's book. With
I love Gorey.
Yeah, it's like a Gorey thing. And it was kind of like it was an orphanage where all the children were mutants, and aliens, and these weird, misguided and weird children. we looked at it, and he had a whole storylines, and each character had their own backstory. It was really fascinating. And it was a wonderful little book. And I said, well, you can't do this live action. Let's do it stop motion animation. We didn't,
Wow.
neither of us knew anything about stop motion animation. And it's very hard to do, but we did it, and we could do it very inexpensive. And it wound up as a TV series in prime time on the CBC.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know if you can find that one. It's called What It's Like Being Alone. Sometimes it's called
Huh.
The Orphanage, but I don't know which name. All these things are probably on YouTube somewhere, but you know how it is. But
Yeah.
yes, but the problem with animation is more of a distribution problem than a production problem. Because in order to get distribution for animation, people are really looking for broad release, right? You don't have small indie film animated projects. Usually you have short films that are animated projects all the time.
Mhm.
But when you think about it, people don't go to the movie theater for an indie low budget animated movie unless it's from Poland or somewhere like that, and very unusual. But animation's really hard these days, and it's a very they really try to rethink the whole way of approaching and marketing animated movies.
Huh.
It's really transforming quickly. I mean, there'll always be the Pixar movies and those kinds of movies, but those are usually self-generated. They don't go out looking for scripts.
Uh-huh. Right. So that's a great case where if you have, for example, a children's book that's been successful.
It's always great to start with a book. If you have a book and you can show people a book that has been marketed successful, that's always, or a graphic novel, for example.
Yep.
Incredibly helpful because you can't just pitch a script. You have to have visual images. You have to show the design, the world, the whole aesthetic of an animated film. You can't.
Right. A friend who's a very accomplished children's author wrote Mulan as a kid's story, and it got picked up by Disney. He didn't put it out there to Disney, but then of course,
the story first.
And he had no intent. He made his living from writing kids' books. He didn't have an intention of making a film. They contacted him, and then of course that led to many writing assignments. And
that's a great example of what I mean, Robin. Is too many people think, oh, I have to write a screenplay, and that's not always the best way to actually get a project moving forward in Hollywood or anywhere. It's not always about the screenplay.
Fred, I have a couple projects myself where I've written, I have the setting in another country. I've even had ideas like for Canada. So my question is, for those of us that set our stories in a country that we don't live in, is it that much harder or impossible to get it seen?
No,
when you were at the CBC, did it matter?
You have to go find the Canadian production company or the French production company or the Greek production company. I mean, the good news is there's obviously no limitations anymore of even what language, it's done in. Netflix, 35% of their content is now foreign language, and they buy Turkey and Spain and Italy and Norway and everywhere, right? So it's really remarkable how that's changed. That's a huge shift because it used to be, subtitles were like death in America. Nobody wanted to read subtitles, and now people seem to be okay with that. So the answer is no. You can do it. It just means you really have to early on find a partner in that country. Because otherwise, but the good news is a lot of these countries have government support, they have tax credits, they have different, unlike America, they have different funding sources that really help. And then they have co-production. So when I was in Canada, we had treaties with 57 different countries.
Wow.
Co-productions with South Africa and Australia and Germany and, everywhere. And so you could combine the financing from multiple countries. Sometimes we would do 3 ways, in order to get shows financed because you were trying to compete with, American product, right? So you needed to get a bigger budget. So that was another part of moving to Canada, getting this job, was opening my mind up to the fact that everything doesn't revolve around Hollywood and Los Angeles. There's a huge film and television industry out there all over the world, and the
Right.
audiences are all looking for projects and things to do. So I wouldn't be intimidated by the idea of setting a story somewhere else, but again, you really have to have a partner from there pretty early on in the process.
That makes sense. Yeah. By the way, just a quick note, we have only 10 minutes left with you. So if anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat box so we can ask Fred.
I see a question from John, and he wants to know gossip about stars you've worked with.
I don't know if that's interesting.
Yeah.
But all I can tell you is actors are the most insecure people in the world.
Yeah.
And once you realize that, I don't care how big a star they are, they're all insecure. And you just have to be able to navigate around their insecurities.
Interesting.
So much of it is just getting them to feel comfortable and happy, and I don't know. I could talk for 2 hours about movie stars I've worked with. I don't think that's at this point relevant to these writers,
Right.
Well, Christiane just asked, and this might be difficult for you, just like we asked you about your favorite projects, but do you have a favorite genre?
That's also a tough question. I particularly like I like history a lot, and I love literature. And some of my favorite projects were adapting, great pieces of literature into movies or TV shows, and it's a unique challenge, but that can often be particularly fascinating and interesting because you have a fantastic story, you have a fantastic, something that people have read for whatever hundreds of years, or so I would say that's but again, as a new or emerging writer, it's not impossible that you'll find some. First of all, public domain is always a great place to find great material. You don't have to pay a lot of money for the IP. And if you can do something unique with it and adapt it in a unique way, that's sometimes a good idea, because then when someone goes to buy it, they can go, oh, I've heard of the Odyssey, I've heard of Moby Dick, I've heard of Kidnapped, great, let's see what you've been able to do with that great, or Dracula, what have you been able to do with that story? So that's just a personal thing.
That's fantastic. And one of the favorite projects of mine that you did was The Tudors.
The Tudors, yeah. Well, it's history.
Just fantastic.
It wasn't a book that we did, but it was certainly, telling Henry VIII's story. It's only been done 30 times. You kind of can't go.
Yeah. And I can't get enough of that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. I think there is an audience that loves that stuff.
Yeah.
Reinterpretations of Queen Elizabeth forever.
One of my favorite adaptations that you worked on, Fred, was The Secret Garden. I still remember seeing that in the theater with some friends, and that's such a special movie and one of the best
fantastic book
adaptations I've seen.
You, if you did it right, there was be an audience for it, and we were very lucky. And I don't remember exactly how. Well, we had our Hollywood writer, Caroline Thompson, wrote the script. But the key to that was we hired a Polish director, a woman Polish director who had never worked in English. It was her first English language movie. Her name is Agnieszka Holland.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very talented.
Wonderful, yeah.
And she did an amazing job. And because we didn't do it as a Disney version, we sort of did a European version, kind of with a little bit of realism and grittiness and great English cast. And yeah, that's one of my favorites too. And you know what? It stands up. I just saw it like 2 years ago, and it still looked great and played great because it's such a classic story.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's another thing about doing historical stories is they don't date. Sometimes a contemporary, a Nora may not look that interesting 10 years from now.
Right. Exactly. Pamela is asking if you're writing for streamers,
Right.
does it really matter if it's half hour or hour drama or comedy?
That's a great question. It does matter. They're different. They're still, even with the streamers, they fill different needs in terms of the audience. And and what can I say? Half hours should be lighter comedy. Again, very character driven. Doesn't mean there can't be an arc, but it's very character driven. It's funny. It's people like me. I'm an audience. Sometimes I sit down. I only want to watch for a half hour. I don't want to get overly involved in something complicated. So a half hour comedy can be quite,
Yeah,
quite fun and interesting.
right.
1 hour is more likely going to be dramatic. That doesn't mean it can't have a lot of humor in it, but it
Mhm.
obviously needs more narrative propulsion to it. And it needs a hook because you want to make sure they're going to come back the next week and the next week or whatever, watch the second episode and third episode. So they're a little more narrative driven, though character, of course, essential. But a
Mm.
half-hour comedy, if you can make me laugh and I fall in love with a couple of characters, and it doesn't have to have a lot of, depth necessarily. It just can be a clever idea. So I
Mhm.
think you really should know if you're writing a half hour or a 1 hour
Right.
concept, right?
This is an interesting question also. This is from Delisha, who is asking about making a short film, whether it should kind of start, or should it be the most dramatic moment in your piece or the
Yes,
entire
yes.
thing?
No, it should just be the most dramatic moment in the piece.
Okay,
You're not trying to tell the whole story of your movie. What you're trying to do is just help the reader of your script get a better understanding of the tone of what you're looking for, the kind of
The
pace,
heart of it.
setting, and so you shouldn't be worried about narrative wise, are people going to be able to understand, the backstory of what's going to happen in the future. I would always look for sort of the juiciest, most, actor friendly part, and just if you can do that well, then the reader will be able to use that as a tool to help understand your script better in the whole.
yeah, that's great.
That's awesome. We have one more question here. How common is it for the writer to also be a producer on a feature film project?
Uh, it depends on how much clout the writer has.
Mhm.
A lot of writers become producers now. A lot of writers become directors, and the reason they become directors is they get tired of seeing people screw up their scripts, right? So, and now in television, of course, because in film the director's really the guy. He's really calling the shots and in charge. That's not true in television. In television, it's really the producer, or should I say, the showrunner, who's usually the writer, because that's what's important, is ultimately the script, the arc of the story. Directors in television often come and go. You'll have 4 different directors working on a series, and directors don't even usually come to the editing room very much. And so
Oh,
television is much
interesting.
more a writer's medium.
Hmm.
And in order for the writer to really have the control and the vision and see it through, they often become one of the producers as well.
That's
In
great.
film, it rarely happens. It doesn't even matter so much.
Yeah. I know everybody here could talk to you all day long. But
Well, let's do
we
one more.
promised to kick you out at
That's okay. Let's
10:45.
do
You have 1 minute.
one more
And
question.
Christiane has a question. What is the responsibility of the showrunner?
Oh, okay. Well, the showrunner, hopefully, well, not always. Sometimes the show is created by an inexperienced writer who just had a
Mhm.
great idea, wrote a script, then the network or the streamer will hire a showrunner, an experienced writer, who then will help work with the creator to guide the whole series. Because what the showrunner, of course, has to do is produce all the scripts, right? And that's why often television, you have a writer's room, you don't just have one person who writes all 10 episodes, you have multiple writers working on it, and someone has to organize all of that. So sometimes they'll call on them the producer, and But the best producers are usually also writers, and then they call them showrunners. You usually don't have a showrunner who's not a writer, right? And so their job is really not just necessarily to write scripts, but to sort of just organize and make sure that all the different writers, that everything's following a flow throughout the series, that things are lining up and making sense. You're laying pipe in episode 2 for something that's going to happen in episode 4. And so you really need one person overseeing all of it, unless you just have one writer who's just writing everything, but that's not usually how it's done these days.
Yeah.
Anyhow, great to sort of meet you all, and great
Thank you so much.
And I hope this was all helpful. And obviously you can tell that we could go on and on like this for hours, but come to Scotland and we will.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And before you go, I just want to say, we all appreciate you. And we had one comment earlier from Sarah, and I think this is great. She said, I've attended many Zooms about screenwriting and how to get projects made. Fred's take on it has been the most encouraging. That's refreshing.
Good.
So
Yeah.
thank you, Fred.
I mean, there are a lot of people can say, don't bother, or the world sucks and too much chaos. Yeah. I just don't live my life that way. And, and I've been very lucky. I don't know, but, if I just think, look for opportunities. You never know where they're going to come from. Be open to anybody. And you have to just trust that, you have something you really want to say, and you have no choice. You have to do this,
Yeah.
If you don't have to do this, it's going to be very hard. I admire writers more than anyone else in the industry. By the way, there are no writers. There are tons of directors and actors and producers, and there are no writers. And every time I meet a young person, they say, "Oh, I don't." The first thing I always ask them, "Do you know how to write?" I said, and they say, "You should write." It's the hardest thing to do, but it's also the most limited resource. It's where there's less and therefore more opportunity than in any other part of the film and television industry. But it takes that discipline to sit in a chair and just write. I don't know how I couldn't do that. I don't know how anybody does that. Just sit for 6 or 7 hours a day, day after day, writing.
Yeah.
Have something, there has to be something inside you that's really motivating you. And it can't be just because you think it's a way to make money.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Good
Thank you, Fred, again, Fred. So nice
Bye,
of you.
Fred. Thank you so
Really
much.
appreciate it.
Bye.
For everybody else that's still with us, as Fred
turn
said,
cameras back on.
As Fred said, he will be one of our mentors this October at a very special concept and development retreat. We'd love to have you. If you have any questions, send us an email or go ahead and fill out an application. There's no money involved in the application. You can just talk with Robin and I later. But we have a few partial scholarships available, right, Robin?
Yep. So we'd love to hear from you. And last week when we had the incredible Christopher Lockhart, we didn't get to all the questions about log lines in time. So people have been sending their log lines to us just for advice. And, we're not Christopher, don't pretend to be, but it's always good to get another take on what you're doing. And, as we all know, writing can be a very lonely kind of existence. So don't hesitate to reach out if there's some way we can help you regarding the retreat or otherwise. Happy to talk to you all. So thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your Memorial Day weekend.
All right. Take care.